All right, so it's Christmas night, and I got a little time after all the events of today. And I want to do a quick video on the wise men that went to visit Jesus. And this is one of those interesting things where there's facts and then there's lore. So we're going to cover what really kind of pretty much happened. So, to begin with, all the nativity scenes show all the shepherds and the wise men there. But that's not quite how it happened. You see, the wise men, whenever Jesus was born, they were in the east and they saw a star over Judea. And they realized the star indicated that the King of the Jews, the Messiah from God, was being born. So they had to get from there all the way over to Jerusalem, which is 600 to 700 miles. And in that day and age, they would have had to have traveled in a large group with camels and people walking. And so going 700 miles by camel with people walking on the ground, I think I read somewhere that they estimated that it takes at least 4 months to walk that far. Could have been longer though. So they weren't there the night Jesus was born. So here's some other things. Now the question is how did these wise men, these magi in the east, know anything about this? It doesn't make any sense. They were in the east, so how do they know about the prophecy for the Jews? Well, I actually found the answer to this randomly when I was reading other things. So whenever the Jewish people were taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar, they were taken to Babylon. And after Daniel got his training and got put into the temple court of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And he brought all the head magi there, the wise men, the magi, and he said, I want you to interpret my dream. And they said, no problem, tell us what the dream is. And he said, no, if you really know, you'll know what the dream is. And if you don't, then you're a bunch of frauds, and I'll have all your heads cut off. So they freaked out and they said, King, nobody knows what other people's dreams are. We can interpret it if you tell us, but we don't know what it is. So he goes, I've spoken, that's how it is. So that's when Daniel came forth. God told him what the dream was, and he was able to interpret it for Nebuchadnezzar. At that point, Nebuchadnezzar said, Daniel, you are now in charge of all the magi. So Daniel, under Nebuchadnezzar, as a young man, probably in his 20s maybe, became the head of the Magi's. Now, what is a Magi in Babylon like? That is a person who reads all the ancient scripts from all the different countries, gets all the information they can, they just learn. They also know a lot about astrology. In ancient Babylon, they have actual observatories where they could look out and see the star alignment. So think of a person who reads a lot combined with an astrologer. That's what a magi is. He's a wise man, but he also looks at the star to interpret future events. So he's not a prophet. He kind of gives you these vague opinions of what he thinks is going to happen. And it's almost always good news, because if he delivers bad news, he'll get his head cut off. So this is what magi are, and Daniel was the head of the magi. So if you think about it, the magi had all of the information taken from Judea. They had all of the ancient texts in the Old Testament up to that time that they could study. They also had Daniel, who had a direct line of communication with God. So when the angel Gabriel told Daniel that the Messiah was coming in 483 years from the time that the order to rebuild Jerusalem was released, the Magi would have known this from Daniel. So whenever they saw this star, because remember that's part of their job is to look at the night sky, when they saw this star over Jerusalem in them looking west, and they saw the star line right up with Jerusalem and Judea, and this very, very bright star, they said, this star means something. What could it mean? And they started poring over their scrolls. And then they would have discovered that Daniel told them that they were within about a 33-year period of when Messiah was supposed to come. And they would go, the stars over Judea, we're down to, 453 years out of the 483 for the Messiah. That must mean that the Messiah was just born and he's got to grow up. So from Daniel is how the Magi figured it out. The Magi would then have to go to whoever the king was and request to send a delegation to Jerusalem. Okay, so the king would have to put together the delegation of the wise men, the camel train, all that stuff, guards to protect them, because if you travel by camel train and you're rich, you're going to be attacked by bandits unless you have guards to dissuade them. And then they might have been like, okay, it's the middle of winter, so we got to wait till spring before you leave. So that makes a lot of sense that basically they would wait a couple months and then they would leave and head to Jerusalem, and it would then take them 4 or 5 months to get there. Okay, so Jesus would have been around, give or take, a year old. And then they went to Herod and they asked him, where's the king of the Jews that was just born? And he's like, what are you talking about? And he brought in his priests and said, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? And they said, oh, it's in Bethlehem, because that's in the ancient scrolls from one of the prophets that he'd be born in Bethlehem. So he said to the wise men, okay, go to Bethlehem and then come back and report to me where the Messiah is so I can go and worship him too. So the wise men then went to Bethlehem, and a star led them. They saw the star again, and they were able to find Jesus and worship him, and they gave him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So basically incense, gold, and perfumed oil, basically is what they gave him. All rich people stuff, what kings like to get. So they gave them all that. But an angel gave them a dream saying, do not return to Herod, he wishes to harm the boy. So they went and traveled a different way home. And everyone says that there were 3 wise men, but we don't actually have a number. We know there were 3 gifts, but we don't know how many wise men went. However many wise men went, which we know it's more than one because it's plural, but however many Magi went from Babylon area, it could have been a dozen, who knows? But they brought 3 gifts. So people took the 3 presents and combined it into 1 gift per Magi. So that's a misnomer too. So nevertheless, it all leads back to the Magi of Babylon, who Daniel saved, were then able to recognize when the Messiah was born because of Daniel's future instruction and because they watched the stars. And the people in Judea only paid attention to the moons. They never looked at the star constellations for any information, because the priests there in Judea they weren't stargazers. They basically used the moon to time their months and their holy days, but outside of that, they really didn't pay attention to the sky much. And it's funny because even Jesus comes back and says, you don't know the signs of the time. You're totally unobservant. So, nevertheless, that's the true story of the wise men, of the Magi. Is they most likely came from Babylon. Daniel's the one who gave them all the insights to let them know what the future event was going to be, the prophetic event. They recognized that. They went to their king. He sent a delegation of them to go deliver gifts. And they went and found Jesus, worshipped him, gave him the gifts. But an angel warned them to go back a different way. And they went back to Babylon a different way without reporting back to Herod. So again, that's the true story of the Magi. So then Herod, because he asked the Magi when they saw the star, he sent his guards to Bethlehem to kill every child under the age of 2, which again, we know Jesus was probably, give or take, around 1. So Herod was just being, overly cautious by saying, don't kill all the 1-year-old and under, kill all the 2-year-olds and under to make sure you get the 1. Bethlehem was kind of a rural town, so some people guesstimate that it might have been 15 to 20 children were lost. In that, it wasn't a big city, it was a small village. So they wouldn't have had a huge population of babies for this horrible thing to happen. But again, it was one of those things that you see it in these nativity scenes and everyone goes, oh, there were 3 wise men. No, we don't know how many there really were. And they were there when Jesus was born with the shepherds. No, they weren't. They had to travel all the way from Babylon 700 miles to Jerusalem, and it takes a while to get a train like that together and get permission and to wait for the better time to travel, the better time of year. So nevertheless, that's the real story of the wise men, and Merry Christmas to all.